close the doors. Okay, people are still coming in, but I think we should start punctually. So I'm obviously super excited to have Mario Draghi here. We often say a speaker needs no introduction, but this time it's actually true. So I will not introduce Mario Draghi, except to say that for me he is the most influential and consequential European economic policymaker, certainly since the global financial crisis, if not over a longer period. And we are all very grateful for what he did, particularly in saving the euro, for what he did in connection with the NGEU funds when he was Prime Minister of Italy, and now we are very grateful for his terrific report, which came out exactly 2 weeks ago, I believe, and which is quite a mouthful. It's certainly the most impressive report of its kind that I have ever seen. And it is impressive because it has a coherent framework, but also because it has a level of sector specificity that normally these reports lack. And it is that sector specificity that we need to address today. We are beyond the moment when we can only talk about framework conditions. The report takes big risks. It is a radical report, as Mario did say in various speeches before, and that also creates a risk for its reception. So it is completely clear that intellectually this will be an extremely influential piece. What we want to achieve is that it's also a practically very influential piece, and so today's event is intended to make it practically influential, both by giving Professor Draghi a chance of sort of restating what he's trying to do, and by giving us a chance to ask questions and address those bits of the report where the risks, the opportunities are greatest, where the potential blowback is going to be greatest, and to potentially diffuse some of that blowback. So that's what we're trying to do here, and we will start with a brief introduction by Professor Draghi, followed by Q&A. Just to give you an expectation, I will ask roughly 5 questions, depends a bit on how much time we have. We will then open to the floor. We will organize the questions in rounds, and we also, of course, have questions from the online audience who can ask questions on Slido, and the Slido term is #competitiveness. Mario, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me say that I'm very, very moved by this welcome. I didn't expect to find so many familiar faces. Some of them have really accompanied me for a very long stretches of my life, and so I'm moved. And I want to thank Jeremy for his very kind words and for this event. I also want to thank Bruegel for its reaction to the report, and it contained many insights and suggestions for further thought. But before I move forward with this very short introduction, let me say once more a word of thanks to all the people who actually produced the report. I think if I can suggest to read carefully the list of acknowledgements, and it also is subject to updatings as soon as we come to discover other inputs in the report. And it's to all of them, economists, associations, politicians, institutions, that I really want to thank very warmly. The report covers many sectors, but today I just want to leave 3 messages with you at the very beginning of this Q&A. The first is what is really, if there is one common theme in the whole report, is that we should strive to increase productivity growth. And that is not only, as often is presented to do, it's not only related to our living standards. It's essential, of course, to raise our living standards, but it has to do with being able to deliver on our values. Values that are values of prosperity, but also values of equity, of security, of independence. And that's become, given the changed geopolitical context, it's become, in my view, a political, I would say, I don't want to use too emphatic words, but certainly a political, how should I say, priority. Let me keep a little modest with words. It's certainly a very important political priority. By the way, amongst the values where we should be able to deliver, we have first and foremost climate. And the second message is that I want to leave is that the most important step that we have to undertake to achieve the objective is to integrate our markets. First, the single market. I think it's only the single markets and the public goods that come with this. Why it's so important? Because if productivity is the objective, scale in many of the sectors that we analyze has become, in a sense, it's an essential ingredient. And scale, you get it only if we integrate single markets. And then we'll have money. And then we'll have need for financial integration. But the very first thing is to be able for the small, medium-sized, innovative firms to be able to scale up. We save a lot. We've plenty of money. What we don't have is scales, which is hampered by cross-national barriers and by cross-national regulation. So that's the second message, that I think we will have to have a EU focus in what we do. And the scale that I'm referring to is the only scale that is commensurate with our current challenges. And it's the only quality, it's the one quality which member states lack. Individual member states don't have this scale. And that's another, in a sense, relatively novel perception that comes from this new environment, from this new geopolitical context. Individual countries are just too small to cope with our challenges. The third message is more nuanced, and like all the nuanced messages, it's also the most liable to be misinterpreted. But the message is this: while we are improving and striving for innovation and raising productivity, we should also manage the trade-offs of the present. Our economy, the EU economy, will continue to depend for some time on mid-tech sectors to generate productivity, integrate new technologies like AI. And the report argues for the need to have a European strategy to manage the trade-offs that these mid-tech sectors will imply. And there are two reasons why. The level playing field is not level any longer. Our economies, our industry, is increasingly on an unlevel playing field, and competition from abroad is being driven, yes, by innovation, but also by massive asymmetries in industrial policies and subsidies. But there is a second reason why a EU-wide strategy is so important in this, and that the alternative to having a EU-wide industrial strategy is not, like some people want to think, no industrial strategy at all. No, It's many national industrial strategies, tiny industrial strategies, uncoordinated industrial strategies, with lots of drawbacks that we see today. And it means leaving it up to every member state to determine which technologies are strategic, which are not, creating very fertile ground for defending national champions, rather than developing European strengths. It means sacrificing competition, because state aid is happening mostly at national level, and distorting the allocation of funding in Europe. And it also means poor results, as some sort of recent failures of high-profile national projects attest to. So, in conclusion, don't get me wrong, I want Europe to stay open. I want a level playing field, and we must be ambitious. We want to strive for innovation. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I would say that in the public perception of the report, the two messages that had the strongest immediate impact, which at some level does not do justice to the full nuance of the report, is your call for much bigger investment, and the point that some of this investment must be publicly funded, and finally, importantly, to do much more at the European level. So you have spoken directly to the last point in what you just said. So I want to take you up on the call for much larger investment. So I think that, you know, we can disagree about numbers, but certainly I don't think this call per se is controversial. What is controversial is the breakdown between private and public components of this investment. So maybe before we get into questions about financing of the public side, could you just reiterate why the public side is important? So there are some views that I've recently heard, including in my own country, Germany, that argue that, yes, of course, we have a big investment needs in climate, but the way to do this is to change relative prices, carbon taxation, that creates the right investment, and then the private sector will take care of it. Why do we need the public sector? And what is sort of the order of magnitude, possibly, as a share of the total investment need that you think should be borne by the public sector?
Thanks, Chairman. You said it's not, I mean, the overall amount is not controversial, but actually the very first reactions were disputing this amount. And just let me make this point once more. This amount comes from a bottom-up calculation made independently by the European Commission and the European Central Bank. And it goes step by step, target by target, as they have been presented in the last 5, 6 years by the European Commission. Let's say Repower EU, Digital Decade, the 5G, the broadband targets, the 3% commitment to increase R&D in Europe, and then we go to defense with the 2% commitments to raise defense expenditures for NATO members. And we come to this amount, 700, 800 billions, roughly slightly less than 5% of European GDP. Incidentally, these numbers are a relatively conservative estimates because they don't include climate adaptation and protection, which, as we unfortunately see all at an increasing rhythm, are becoming more and more needed. They don't include investments in education, in skills formation, which is going to be needed, as the report argues, and they may not include other things. So this is a very big amount. Now, is this only wholly additional amount? I think that was one part of your question. I don't think so. Certainly there may be other, I mean, if the private sector is so agile as to redirect its investments towards the higher productivity sectors at the frontier, if we are also collectively reactive and common-minded to reform the single market structures and integrate fantastically well and soon, we certainly, I mean, this number, the amount of public funding that is needed is going to be shortened a lot. So we won't need so much public money as the report suggests. So that is one thing I want to make. In a sense, I said at the very beginning of my little introduction before. This is the best course of action. And by the way, it's essential. Whether the issue is the sooner we do it, the better it is. So, but let's see how we came to suggest this. The traditional splitting of investment is 80% private, 20% public. So we had conversations at some point where such a big amount would create a big shock for the European economy. Aren't there constraints to capacity to satisfy this big jump in investment? And the answer, of course there are. And so we asked the IMF on one side and the European Commission on the other to check with simulations, to macroeconomic simulations, to see whether this figure would be a realistic figure or could simply be a destabilizing figure and therefore unrealistic. And the answer was that to keep the historic split 2080 would have caused a change in various financial parameters that would make this figure unrealistic. And that's how the split 50-50 comes from. That is the split which makes this figure realistic. But it's a simulation outcome. What I would retain of this, even of the simulation effort, is the fact that even with a small amount, with a small increase in productivity, which the IMF foresees as 0.2% a year for 10 years, so it's a tiny increase in productivity, the overall amount is realistic and the public funding is less. So that's the basic thing. And again, this message means what? That if we do the reforms, productivity would go up, and this sort of perceived very difficult drama, political drama of having to finance this actually takes more realistic dimensions. But there is one point that I have to make. We will need public money anyway. And that has to do with the fact that some of these big investments, especially the bigger ones, are investments in public goods. And we know that the private sector tends to underfund public goods investments for a variety of reasons, one of which is that they have lots of spillovers, which is what we want, but which is not necessarily what a private investor wants. So we will need that. Investments in power grids, in digital grids, in knowledge, and so on, in climate, all these connectivity investments, and then so that is something that we have to, not necessarily only public. As a matter of fact, for example, many private sector companies are very interested in investing in grids. So they would like to be present there since the beginning, probably, but only with a company of the public sector.
Thank you. This is clear. I will get back on this really interesting question of the macroeconomic impact of such an investment boom in a second. But before we do this, let's sort of tackle the bull by the horns, which is the financing of the public investment. So like you, I believe that for efficiency reasons, right, to save money, a lot of this financing should be at the European level. This then gives us two options. We can finance it within the budgetary envelope of the current EU budget through a restructuring of the budget itself, spending, possibly raising some additional resources, or we can do it through extra debt. Can you say why you think that extra debt might either be desirable or unavoidable? I'm not completely sure which of the two you will go for. And if it is necessary, how do we ensure that EU-level debt doesn't get out of control? I think this is sort of a fundamental concern that many have in Europe, and it's not unjustified. I mean, we have projections now that say even the interest payments on the NGEU debt that has already been issued is going to take up a chunk of the EU budget in the future.
So, Jeremy, it's a lot of questions. I'll try to sort of address all of them. The first is, can we use the EU budget to do that? Well, the EU budget is 1% of GDP. The needs I'm talking about are about between 4 and 5% of GDP. So it's too small. The second question is, can member states finance that out of their own national budgets? The answer is no, because some of them, I think all of them, actually don't have the capacity, fiscal capacity in their national budgets to finance that. There's also another issue that, and here I fully agree with the people who are very concerned about the fiscal sustainability of this huge investment design. If we make a mistake on that ground, the whole thing unravels. It's actually one thing we should keep present all the time, because, and that is true even a member state, because of contagion. So that's another reason, an additional reason why you got to be very careful about not stressing too much national budgets. Fiscal sustainability, unfortunately, I can't say it's a common good. It's a common damage, very easily. And but that doesn't mean that we should forget about this, neither at national nor at collective. So we have to, and that's why, and here I'm sorry I'm repetitious, but that's why the more we do on the reform side, the more this will become, the less this will become an ever-present worry. There is also another reason why we want to have it at the EU level, which has to do with coordination. So basically, if we think about financing these public projects at EU level through the issuance of bonds, whether this is EU bonds like we did with Next Generation EU, or in a different way, it is being suggested we talk about common safe asset. Now, let me put this in the proper context. Again, this was the very first thing people reacted to in the whole report. I have to say, as much as I love this concept, it's not the main thing of the report. But there are many good reasons for having it. It's not an essential ingredient in this report. There are many good reasons for having it, because the financing costs will be lower, because if you really want to do a capital market union, probably this is one of the sufficient ingredients that will make everything infinitely easier, especially if one looks at the US history of their capital markets. It's been built around a common safe asset, but that's not where I would like to have the discussion centered today. Was there any other thing about your list?
Well, maybe just, I mean, you do make it seem, and I actually agree with you, that we will just not be able to meet the investment challenge even taking into account this very important point that there's a trade-off between reforms and the need for public money. I think that's a very, very important message. But as you said, some of these spending needs are intrinsically for the public sector. There are many budgets that are overstretched at the national level, and there are good economic reasons to do it at the European level. So I do agree with you that we will need to finance some of this investment at the European level and probably debt finances. But this still then leaves the concern, do we have an adequate institutional setup to manage the fiscal risks of that at the European level, right? So we have fiscal rules, they have just been reformed. I think that for the most part, the reform goes in the right direction. We do not have something protective at the European level. Maybe we don't need it, because in any case, this requires unanimous decisions every time. But I just wanted to hear your view on that.
I think in asking this question, you call for what some time ago I defined a radical change. Why the use of that word? Because much, not most, but much of what's being suggested in this report does require a big change in the way we do things. Now, we're talking about financing, but consider the many other things, from the common investments we talked about to the decisions about defense and climate and so on. What is being required is something we have to build. First, the capacity of having a common assessment of what the risks are, the dangers are, the trade-offs are across member states and across the Commission. Second, an agreement about which way to go. When I talked about the industrial strategy in Europe, that is what it means. And so this includes the financing. And finally, a decision-making that is less garbled, less muddled than it is today. You know, I mean, I'm saying obvious things. We have many layers of decision-making with multiple vetoes. We have a very long time decision-making. It takes about 19 months for a law project to get actually law in concrete, in fact. So it does require a change of mind. On the financing, I think that if we start agreeing about certain things, I am quite optimistic that we don't need big changes in the financing as such. Again, I said something like that about the common safe asset. I'm saying something like that about the financing as well. If we agree about the direction, if we understand that we are in the midst of this big technological transition, we have to invest a lot. If we make the reforms of the single market, I think the financing will come.
Very good. So I do want to talk about microeconomic policy, industrial policy, trade policy in a second, but before we get there, sort of a final question for the macro nerds. Suppose, just for a minute, this works. So we managed to do the reforms, we managed to mobilize some extra private finances, we get the investment boom. Now, you mentioned you had done some checks with the help of the IMF Research Department and the Commission on what this implies macroeconomically. The question I have is there a, since this is a report on competitiveness, which is supposed to, among other things, worry about the export performance of our manufacturing. If we do all this investment, might we become victims of our own success by having what economists refer to as a Dutch disease type problem? So there is an enormous expansion of domestic demand that appreciates the real exchange rate, making us much less competitive. How should we manage that risk? If you were still in charge at the European Central Bank, or here,
no thanks, no, I'd rather not.
how would we manage that risk?
Now, the the Dutch disease is when the Netherlands discovered natural gas in the North Sea, and that discovery in the 70s caused a big consumption boom. And the result of that was that basically it was a big inflation. The exchange rate, the real exchange rate appreciated, the economy suffered. The key point is basically that the rate in that period of time, the rate of inflation exceeded the rate of productivity growth in the Netherlands between 4 and 7 percentage points. Looking at the IMF simulation of this investment boom, it shows that there is indeed a real appreciation of the exchange rate after 2 years, but by something very tiny, 80 basis points. And 4 years later, the real exchange rate starts depreciating. So all in all, it's manageable. I mean,
got it. Okay, so now let's turn to some of the fundamental questions that I, rather than some unnamed fiscal conservatives, have about your report. And so the first and sort of the biggest one for me is, to what extent this report aligns itself with industrial strategies that we have seen in the United States or possibly even China, and that we have in the past occasionally criticized about the United States. So what I have in mind here, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act. We wrote about this very early on at Bruegel, and our main message was it's better to have it than not to have it because of its climate impact. And we also understand the political economic constraint faced by the Biden administration. So in that sense, Bidenomics was perhaps the right thing to do for the United States. Now, if one looks at the basic strategy that you're proposing, particularly in Chapter 3, in the chapter on reconciling competitiveness and decarbonization, it has a lot of this flavor of the Inflation Reduction Act, in the sense that you're proposing significant subsidies, both for energy-intensive industry, but also for clean tech. And you're proposing a trade policy that is essentially designed to support this industrial policy, including through the use of local content requirement and other things that are sort of questionable under WTO rules. So, like with the Inflation Reduction Act, I think there are some risks here. Of course, some have to do with risks to public budgets by maybe over-financing a set of technologies that in any case are facing a very large additional demand because they are essential for renewable energy, but also the potential unintended consequence for the world trading system. So we have so far held the line as Europeans. We have scrupulously stayed within WTO rules, including in our approach to EVs. Is there a risk that your approach might lead us to violate those rules and, in a sense, contribute to the demise of the international trading system?
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I don't think there is that risk. But let me go step by step. The European Union is an open economy. It's more open than anybody else. 50% of our 50% of our GDP comes from trade, and versus something like 37 in China, 27 in the United States. So if we were to do like the US, we would actually harm ourselves. So the very first thing I would like to express clearly is that we are different from the United States. We cannot build a protectionist wall. We cannot do it, and we wouldn't be able to do it even if we wanted to do it, because we would harm ourselves. I think that's the very first thing. And everything starts from there. Our suggestions in the report are very cautious, sector by sector, and directly addressed only at making the playing field level. Nothing else. So when we look at different level playing field, I think I did say this in the short introduction at the beginning. I said competition abroad is being driven, yes, by innovation. And we should welcome that competition. But it's being driven also by subsidies, industrial policies, state ownership, and other practices. And there we should look with, admittedly, great caution on how to make the playing field level. Our main priority, I agree with you, should be to rebuild the respect for the WTO rules. And we should continue striving to that extent. But we should also know that the WTO rules were the child of a world where there was geopolitical harmony, where there was basically overall agreement, and where free trade was basically agreed by everybody, although, and as you say, there is, I think, a very interesting thing. The first violation of the free trade of the WTO rules is being spotted in a report by the WTO then president in 2003 by the Chinese government. And it was a big violation. A big violation. Nobody did anything. Nobody said anything. Why was that? Well, because it was good business at the time to do it. It was a good thing to ignore this. And the geopolitical configuration would allow to do that. So things have changed. As being the most open economy, by the way, we are also the most vulnerable to violations in the level playing field. And we are also the most vulnerable to retaliation. That's why we have to be careful. And the proposals that are in the report are, most of them, broadly in line with the WTO rules. Some of them may require negotiations. And these negotiations may well take place, although on IRA, on what the Chinese government is doing, there was no negotiation, nothing. So what is the problem? The problem is that the WTO rules have to be revisited together in a multilateral framework and adapted. I think everybody would agree with that, and certainly Europe must be frontline with that, on doing that. One last point. When the negotiating table will actually be taken seriously by all the partners, it's better for us to not only to be there, but to be strong being there. So we cannot allow now to be undermined. But the first line of defense is to grow ourselves. Not subsidies, not tariffs, just restructuring, innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. So I have two more questions on a specific topic, and then we open it. So one is on the proposals for the energy-intensive industry. So you have a very nice in the weeds chapter on this industry, and you make an extremely important point, which is that this is an industry that is hard to abate. It's just very costly to decarbonize. And it's also a very essential industry in Europe for various reasons, including jobs, but maybe that's not the main point, right? It's part of our industrial ecosystem. So we would like to retain it, or at least some of it, in Europe. On the other hand, subsidizing decarbonization of an industry with the interests of the current companies in mind, who obviously would prefer to make the minimum structural adjustment that they have to do, so decarbonize their processes, but ideally keep production where it is right now, also has some costs. So I'm basically concerned about two things. First, we do have other less energy intensive industry in Europe, and this is a public cost. These other industries could be the more dynamic over the medium term. Maybe they are the source of our competitiveness. Are we not, in a sense, stacking the playing field against them? And then the second one, I'm quite concerned that by backing a strategy where abatement happens, where abatement occurs within the current production structure and production sites, may actually discourage changes within Europe that might be efficient, such as locating energy-intensive industry nearer to energy resources. So this is not so much a criticism as a true dilemma. I do not see how we can get this right given these risks. What is and I don't think it is really tackled in the chapter. So what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Jeremy. Before I address this question, let me say one more word about your previous question and why we should actually subsidize our clean tech, green tech industry. Now, we all agree that there is a general case for subsidizing clean tech, and we do it through demand subsidies. But there's also another case for subsidizing production of green tech, in our case. The very first thing is what I said before. Our green tech industry or clean tech industry is not on a level playing field with China. There's also a strategic reason. In perspective, we want all our energy, 100% of it coming from renewables. And we don't want to repeat the situation in which we were with Russia, namely depend for a source of energy from someone that could become our enemy. There is also a strategic reason for protecting the clean energy, for subsidizing production of green energy. And there is also another thing, another consideration, because our dependence on China is not only through final products or through technology, it's also on raw materials, or on CRM, on critical raw materials. And therefore, I think we should encourage, promote all the technologies that would replace these critical raw materials with different ones where we can have easy access to, or politically undisputed access. In other words, given the sort of experience we are having with Ukraine's war, that is something, maybe I'm exaggerating, but perhaps I want to be sure that as far as energy is concerned, we don't find ourselves in the same position as we were 3 years ago. Coming to your point on why to subsidize high energy industries. Let me just say, first, these industries are steel, cement, chemicals, aluminum, and so on. Their output goes everywhere in our economies, goes in any production line. So it's present from normal goods to defense industry, to defense goods.
But some of it could be imported, right?
Right. Some of it could be important, exactly. So we cannot simply say, I mean, we don't care. We simply let them go. Go means either they shut down and we simply import things from other countries, or they do relocate to some other country outside. We want to retain some of this in our continent. They are also, like the others, are not on a level playing field with foreign competition. So I think the case for supporting is, I think, is unquestionable. The whole issue is how to design this support. And the report there is pretty clear, I think. The main support should be towards decarbonization. And it should be expressed with clear benchmarks. It should be conditional on investing towards reaching those benchmarks within a certain specified amount of time, which is, I think, technologically known. So there shouldn't be any uncertainty there. That's why, but we should do more than that, because the more we look into this, the more complex this decarbonization process is. So one strategy that's outlined in the report is to create green hubs, namely to co-locate the sources of renewable energies together with the hard-to-abate industry. So you would have hydrogen-based steel mill plants, or carbon capture together with cement production. I think we should do that. At the same time, the whole technological transformation we are living through, and my view is that we are just at the beginning, will certainly call for big restructuring of these industries, many other, by the way, all industries, but these industries especially, because they have been the most affected by the energy transformation. And we should be careful about not hampering this restructuring. For example, if these industries want to relocate to other parts of the European Union, that's a process that it should not be, say, hampered, for sure. And we should do more, however, because these industries very often are rooted in their environments. They have long histories. They employ millions of people. So that's where, in a sense, we are in a better position than the United States. We have a strong welfare system that now it could be well put at profit through a reskilling of the people in these regions. And we have it's not in our values, it's not in our history, so there is no danger we actually abandon people like, in fact, it happened in some parts of the United States in the 90s. So that's the way I would look at this problem. It's a combination.
Thank you. Final question from me on competition policy. So I can only recommend to the audience to read the chapter on competition policy. It's really short. It's one of the nicest in the report. It's extremely nuanced, very powerfully written. And you know, the spirit of that chapter is essentially along the lines of a quote by Jean Tirole, which you have in that chapter, that says, look, the problem, there is no real problem with the legal framework of competition policy. It is about how you apply that framework. The framework itself is flexible enough. What we need is people who make the right decisions on application. And so most of the recommendations in the chapter are along those lines, even though you, in some cases, even advocate amending the framework in the sense of greater investigative and enforcement tools. You call for a new competition tool, for example. Yet, for some reason or other, the report has become sort of most famous on competition policy as endorsing this idea, which in my view is just plain wrong, that the current merger regulation is a significant obstacle to scale in the European Union and needs to be changed. And you know, there is a little sentence, not in the competition chapter, but in another chapter on telecoms that maybe gives rise to this impression. So can you maybe just say, how should we read your report on what it says about mergers?
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for asking this question, because it was one of that attracted most attention after the common safe asset. So probably the best way to answer this question is to say what the report doesn't want, what we don't want. We, in the telecom space, we don't want to have 27 national monopolies. Okay? What the report wants is to have a certain number of pan-European competitors that compete fiercely in national markets. These are the objectives. And to this extent, I think these objectives are shared by, I think, everybody in this room, and most people, even in the European Commission, and perhaps not by national operators. But that's what the report aims at having. The second fact is that Europe suffers from a gap, an infrastructure gap, and especially an investment gap with US operators. I remember that giving a speech, I don't know, several months ago, I mentioned the fact that we have something like 35 main operators and 370, or swap, I mean, take these numbers with certain marginal operators. And the US have 4, China has 5, and so isn't this a cause for lower investment in Europe? And the answer is yes. Yes, investment CapEx is way lower. But let me go further than that. Oh, by the way, the whole thing starts from the fact that we need to fill this gap in infrastructure, in broadband, in 5G, and so on. And the ones who invest in this infrastructure are telecom. And why is that important? Well, it's become, if anything, even more important with AI and the need to learn, to train new models. So that's the sort of chain of reasoning. That's why we are worried about that. At present, the rate of return on capital invested is lower than the cost of capital. So at present time, there's no incentive to invest. And everything that's happened in the last few years in that space shows the entrance of a variety, a multitude of operators who have absolutely no interest nor the money to invest. So first of all, then, to understand what we have to do is to ask, why are we in this situation? And the main answer, clearly, is due to the fact, to the big fragmentation of spectrums, allocations auctions, to the uncoordinated evolution of the spectrums, and more generally, uncoordinated national regulations, very fragmented national regulations. But also to a merger policy which basically allowed the creation of marginal operators. And so what we need to do in the future is we want to preserve competition, but we should not hamper scale. We should harmonize spectrum allocations. We should harmonize national regulations. We should really create a European market for telecom. And to do this, that's what the suggestion is that mergers should be decided on dynamic considerations for consumers, especially having in mind scale and innovation, but at the same time without hampering competition.
Yes, this message is very clear, and it is actually in the competition chapter. It's the first recommendation in the competition chapter. But the other important thing I think to take away from what you just said is that a lot of the scale that we need in this sector will come from reforming regulations, particularly related to the single market, that have nothing to do with competition policy per se, but are inhibiting this. Okay, so I do want to take at least 2 rounds of questions. There will be one from the floor here and one from online, and I will take a few together, and that will also give Professor Draghi the opportunity to choose the ones that he would like to answer. So let's start maybe with, I will go first with Maria, and let me go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Please identify yourself, Maria.
Yes, Maria de Mergis from the Conference Board. I wanted to ask a question about the private sector. And the private sector leaves the European Union as far as investments are concerned at the rate of 450 billion per year, which is the current account surplus that we expected to have next year. The private sector has no incentive to invest in Europe in the long term. It's very dangerous. Has no incentive to invest in Europe in the long term, for long-term investments. What would be the one thing to do to incentivize the private sector to stay?
Mario, excuse me. Let's take the whole round. Then it makes it more flexible, I think. Right. Yes, please repeat the question.
What would be the one thing, one change, policy change that we can make in Europe to incentivize the private sector to stay in Europe and not leave?
Okay, the next question goes to Jacob Kierkegaard, Bruegel and Peterson Institute for International Economics.
Well, thank you very much. My question comes back to this issue related to the needed for the investment surge that you already talked with Yeramin about. My question is basically that this needed increase in investment is typically also given as the justification for why we should think about that, say, neutral rates or R star or whatever we choose to call the cost of money in Europe will rise going forward. So my question to you basically is, if European leaders do not, in fact, manage to generate the investment surge that you call for in this report, is there any reason to assume a rising neutral rate or R star, etc., in the European economy? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Tom Scholar in the back row, I believe, formerly with her or now His Majesty's Treasury and also Bruegel Board.
Thank you very much. Your excellent report is about the EU, not the UK, so the UK inevitably doesn't get much of a mention. In fact, if you put UK into the word search for Part A, you get 9 references, but on closer inspection, 7 of the 9 turn out to be references not to the UK but to Ukraine. The perils of word search. That said, the UK faces the same world, most of the same challenges. Much of your analysis would also apply to the UK economy. So my question is, what do you see as the potential for collaboration between the EU and the UK on this agenda, and could that possibly even serve as a vehicle to address some of the deeper issues in the relationship? Thank you.
Okay, let's take 2 more. Is that okay? Or do you want to?
Jeremy,
yes.
You taking note of these questions? Because I'm forgetting all of them.
Okay. Why don't you answer? We'll have a second round. Is it okay for you to go over time?
I can go over the 3 questions immediately.
Okay.
So, first of all, it's not that bad, by the way. I mean, it's not the private sector is not investing in Europe. We have, actually, there are different situations. We have cases in Europe that we should closely look at as what we would like to do. And the report is pretty explicit about quoting Sweden as a place where innovation thrives high, where productivity is the same, if not higher, than in the United States. Why is that? Well, one thing is the financing of the innovation of the private sector in Sweden is 70% plus coming from markets and 30% less coming from banks. So one of the first things you notice is that, which is something we argue in, because banks, with all due respect, are good for many things, but are not good for financing innovation. And so with respect to the specific angle the report takes, namely, we should strive to raise productivity, it's capital markets we want to look at. And that's why integrating capital markets becomes so important. The second thing, actually it's the first thing, is to make these projects attractive, which is to have scale. From this viewpoint, many of the Swedish inventions actually migrate, showing that in Europe they don't have scale. They would stay in Europe. So I think I would suggest let's look at what happens in Sweden, to some extent in the Netherlands and in Denmark. Thank you. The second question is about our start. Now this drives me back to a job I left many years ago. So what happens, the question is, what happens if we don't do the things that we talked about? Well, what happens is that we are reasonably rich continent with a decline in population. That's why the urgency is not perceived so much, because after all, income per capita doesn't fall as much as it should. But if we continue at the present rate of productivity, we know that this will be enough just to keep GDP per capita constant until 2050, which means basically that we won't have enough money for doing everything else. For actually, as I said at the beginning, delivering according to our values. In terms of, I'm sure you were asking, given the fact that you quoted Howard Starr, you were asking what could happen about inflation, basically. My sense is that whether, the issue is not whether we do or we don't. We will certainly do much of what is in this report, because these are irrenounceable. We cannot say no to these. I mean, we cannot say we don't want to protect ourselves. We cannot say we don't want to grow. We cannot say we don't want to keep our social welfare system as it stands and maybe improve on it. So this amount of investment, it's going to happen. Maybe it will take longer, but it's going to happen. And from this viewpoint, if I am asked, as I often am, how do you see the future years? So as high inflation or low inflation? A zero lower bound sort of monetary policy, is it likely or not? In my view, I don't think it's likely at all. We will be living in a period of time where, if anything, we'll have a pressure of too high deficits, too high demand, and potentially higher inflation rates and higher interest rates. I'm not sure. Have I got your in the answer? Thank you. So the final question was about UK. I mean, UK is actually doing some of the things that are being suggested in this report. UK has a cluster, an innovation cluster between London, Oxford, Cambridge, has a capital market functioning, has a privately funded pension fund, which is, by the way, it's another feature of Sweden, Netherlands, and to some extent Denmark, which gives, of course, financing easily available to innovative projects. So I think that's one of the things. You are asking space for collaboration, of course. Big space, big room, and I think big will and big desire to collaborate with the United Kingdom. If you ask me deeper questions about UK productivity, I have to confess my ignorance on that. Thank you.
Okay, so If it's okay, we'll go until 1:45. So I will take one round from online now, and then if you agree, we can go once more back to the floor. So here are 4 questions, very good questions. You may have answered the first one, which is, to what degree do you believe your recommendations will actually get implemented, even if almost everyone seems to agree with them? The second question is, how can the EU's economic policies be designed to reduce economic and social disparities that ultra-right parties often exploit? Third question, regarding EU governance, the report calls for a competitiveness coordination framework. How would this in practice differ from the European semester? And then final, optional, and I can repeat them if you need to. You blame slow productivity growth on weak digital investment, but your recommendations focus on hardware, telecoms, cloud, AI, computers, not services. Why? So here, the idea is that maybe you are too hardware focused on this. Any of these, please.
Well, I can easily answer to the last, say, no, it's not true. We actually look at everything, hardware, software, and in fact, many of the sort of the recommendations that are being suggested the report should make are in the report. Next question was about cohesion policies.
Income distribution.
Yeah. I think that is something the report gives a lot of attention to. The perspective of the report is that we are really entering in a profound, not only technological, but industrial change. And as we've learned from history, these changes have deep social implications. And that's where really, I said at the very beginning, we started this report thinking about what our values are. And one of our main European values is social inclusion. And so the report gives a lot of attention to lifelong learning process, adult training, vocational training, education in various member states, and so on. That's so cohesion policies are essential. And there is also a further thought about this. Shouldn't cohesion policies change somehow, given the change that's taking place in the industry? And the answer is yes. They should be, in a sense, more oriented than ever to connectivity, both physical connectivity, speed rail trains and so on, but also especially digital connectivity. That's where I said before, where we have a gap in investment gap and in sort of infrastructure gap. We have the broadband is nowadays concentrated in the most affluent parts of our economies, and it should go everywhere. Nowadays, it's become important. So it's important for cohesion, but it's also important for making progress on AI on all sorts of aspects. Thank you.
Okay, last round from the floor. Go ahead, please. And then Guntram, please, and then the lady here in the third row, and then we may have time for one more. Yes, in the back over there. Please go ahead. And identify yourself, please.
Yes, Alain Takoun from Electricité de France. So thank you very much, Professor Draghi, for your excellent report. And for my company, we are very happy to see a clear reconnection of nuclear within the report. I would have 2 questions on energy-intensive industries. The first one is based on one of your recommendations. Can't we see a risk of distortion of prices between energy-intensive industries if they have contract at cost and domestic customers? And can't we structure the help for investment to this industry in a bank like an electrification bank, as we did for the hydrogen today in Europe? Thank you.
Can you maybe repeat? So the first point was on distortions caused
Yes,
by
but can't we see a potential distortion between prices of contracts made at cost for energy-intensive industries and the prices for domestic customers? And my second question is, can't we imagine to structure investment to energy-intensive industries by using a sort of bank of electrification for industry?
So an electrification bank,
as Europe is doing today,
analogous to
hydrogen.
To a hydrogen bank.
Sorry, I didn't understand your question, so maybe Jeremy, you did.
Yes. So the question is whether electrification should be an essential component of an industrial electrification, and if so, whether one should design an instrument that is analogous to the hydrogen bank. That was the second question. Guntram, please.
Yeah, Guntram Wolfert-Brügel and Université Libre de Bruxelles. I have two quick questions. One is on industrial policy. A central problem of industrial policy is that the political system gets captured by vested interests. And we know from the literature that industrial policy works particularly well if that isn't the case, and in particular if industrial policy is pro-competition, meaning it increases competition rather than decreases it. For example, Philippe Aguillon and others have done research on that. How can we think of this interplay between industrial policy and political vested interests? I mean, let's just take the example of car industry. How do we make sure that we create more competition, not less, such as is actually the case in the electric car industry in China? The second quick point is on the defense industry. It's a super important sector, of course, for security reasons. The case for the single market for scale is clear. The counter argument is security. Vested security interests are different across the continent. Now, if we don't fully trust all European countries, what do we do? Do we do it in smaller scale? And can you perhaps say also a word about the productivity effects of the defense industry?
Sure. Yes, I know. Okay.
The first one is about grids. I haven't spoken extensively of grids, but as a matter of fact, grids is one of the most important projects for energy and for everything, really. If we don't, there is one estimate, let me see if I can remember it correctly, but if we don't address this issue with actually what's called IPCEI, investment projects of investment European projects of common interest, in the next 10 years, we lose 40 times the energy we lose today for renewable energy. What does it mean? It means that we can build as many solar or wind or nuclear too plants as we want, but this will not. If we are not able to transport energy, we are going to lose it. Right now, we are losing a lot of this already. So grids are essential for everything we discussed before. And by the way, the way grids are managed is also going to change profoundly through the use of AI. We have, for example, the north of Germany has wind, the south of Germany consumes energy. How to bring energy from the north to the south? You need grids. Hydrogen will also add to the needs for grids. Because of course we have to now. Apparently there was some of the current natural gas grids can be kind of retrofitted, but others cannot. It's not a simple issue, but it's a very urgent issue. On industrial policy, let me say something that I kind of touched upon before. The alternative in introduction, as a matter of fact, the alternative, it's not that we don't have industrial. Right now, the alternative is between national industrial policies and EU industrial policy. So that's what we should strive at having a EU industrial policy. Second, industrial policy and competition, absolutely. And one way to make sure, one way, and it's not that you do everything with that, but you certainly, one way to prevent industrial policy becoming slave of national vested interest is to sort of lift it to a higher level. But there's another thing, the suggestions we have in this report. We say that in some cases, for example, what we really care about is to have, we don't care about whether the technology comes from abroad. What we care is about having jobs in Europe. So in certain situations, we may well allow foreign direct investments into Europe, using technologies that are not produced in Europe. And this is part of the industrial policy. In that way, we will increase competition. Thank you.
Thank you. So, two final questions. I want to give the ladies a chance here. Ann Mettler and then the lady with the polka dot. Ann, you go first, please. Sorry. So this is Ann Mettler of Breakthrough Energy.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for an excellent report. I guess to the extent that there is a blueprint for the investment offensive that you are calling for, it's Next Generation EU. And I was wondering if you could give an assessment whether you consider that a success according to the principles that you call for. Has it driven productivity, innovation, advances in the single market? Has it made Europe more attractive as an investment destination? Has it led to technology breakthroughs? I'd be very interested before we spend significantly larger sums of money in the future that we would have an assessment from you on Next Generation EU. Thank you.
Final question. Second row. Lady in the black dress.
Thank you, Giovanna Fagionato from Politico. You said very clearly that if few countries agree on the reforms you propose, that if few countries agree on the reforms you propose, the amount of public funding is going to decrease, needed is going to decrease. So is the trade-off about more public funding and sovereignty, and passing on sovereignty to the European institutions? And second question, in your report you propose to put forward measures to make it easier to for banks and other investors to make riskier investments. So I would like riskier investments. So my question is, can you tell us more about how rules for banks should change? Is just a matter of offering broader guarantees or more guarantees, for example, through the EIB, or is something more that should change for banks?
Right. So, success of NGU, the fact of whether how to incentivize more risk taking in investment, and whether that requires a change in the rules or maybe EIB guarantees. And then there was this sophisticated question on whether the trade-off between money and coordination means that we just need to do much more at the EU level.
Yeah. Well, whether the Next Generation EU has actually moved along the line of this report, it's very early for me. I have no visibility right now on whether this has been a big push. Certainly certain parts of it, investment in the green energy production, that is certainly in line with this report, that I know. These investment in grids that have taken place, that is in line with this report, and that has happened. Installments of new renewable energy capacity is one of the things that's happened following the Next Gen EU. So I think that is what I know, and that's when the investments have moved, the investment decisions, public investment decisions have moved in the direction of this report. But there is much I don't know about present investments of the report, of the Next Gen EU. let's not forget that not all of the Next Gen EU was along the line suggested in the report. Some of it has been traditional infrastructure. Some others, for example, was for the construction of daycare centers. To the extent that daycare centers call for greater participation by women to the labor force and make room for improving education and acquiring new skills, that would be in the direction suggested by this report. Second question is about trading between sovereignty and money. Well, if you think that sovereignty means to have tiny firms that are not able to expand or don't even start since the space is too narrow for them, to this extent, yes, there is a trade-off. You want to give to your own firms a bigger market where they can expand, and then you have to agree about rules that are in the common interest. I think that in this sense, perhaps, I wouldn't put it this way, however, because I think that sovereignty is a concept in this framework. Let me step back. One of the things that I keep on saying, maybe I said it in the introduction, is that all our countries are too small to cope with the size, the scale of the present challenges. So the sovereignty concept that underlies this report is a European sovereignty, is not national sovereignty. Everything we see today shows that national sovereignty is too weak. It's too weak a concept.
I think that's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Mario, also for being extremely generous with your time.